Manvir. As Gurjeet introduced me, I'm very pleased to be here. Our journey was very long, 22 hours from Toronto, but we made it. And I'd like to thank Jagara and Sikholars for having us here. It's an honor. I didn't know when I began writing my paper and doing my research that I was going to present it here in front of all of you, so it's great to be here. As was explained a little bit, I just graduated from McMaster University in my master's, which is kind of a tongue twister, in Globalization of the Human Condition. And I'm also the founder of a nonprofit organization based in Brampton. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Brampton, but the nonprofit is called Laadliyan Celebrating Daughters, and we raise awareness about the gender inequality, which is very, very persistent in our community, even in countries like Canada and the United States. So my paper, my research, which I gave the name, Between Two Worlds, Where Do Punjabi Canadian Women Belong, kind of came out of, I guess, personal experiences or just seeing girls around me. And I know there's a lot of girls in the room today which fit the criteria of what my research participants, which age group they were from. And I'm glad to see that we have some parents in the room, so it'll be nice to get their perspective on my findings. So the reason I wanted to do this particular project was because I wanted to examine the bicultural identity of second generation Punjabi women born and brought up in Canada. And this also applies to Punjabi women born and brought up in the States. A second generation immigrant, as I'm sure a lot of you guys are aware, is someone whose parents are first generation immigrants. So anyone whose parents were immigrants. And I wanted to look at if these women were able to balance both the cultures, so the Canadian culture and the Punjabi culture, successfully, or if one ever overpowered the other, and if it did, create any barriers, social barriers for them, in terms of just everyday things and how it kind of plays into your identity. And I know Rupi touched on this a little bit, so you might find my research interesting. I don't know, because you were talking about identity and. Also with Laadliyan's presentation. So in terms of methodology, it was a qualitative study and it was done in Brampton, Ontario. Brampton is a very, very suburban town, and most of its population is South Asian, and that's where I grew up as well. I went to school there. And I conducted interviews with 10 women who were between the ages of 18 and 24, and we did face-to-face in-depth interviews. And I got a lot of information. I could possibly write 16 different essays based on each question I asked them, but obviously I had a word limit, so I couldn't go over that. But yeah, so at the beginning of the research project, it was really crucial for me to understand what constituted as Punjabi and Canadian in terms of culture for all of the participants. So I asked them to all explain what each term meant to them. So in terms of the Punjabi culture, there were two sides to it. Most of the participants first and foremost used words such as unequal, gendered, concrete, traditional, and backwards to describe Punjabi culture. And then all of a sudden they were saying how our food is really yummy and our language is really pretty and we emphasize family a lot, we emphasize community a lot, but it's still unequal and it's still very gendered and it limits me in a lot of ways. And then when I asked them about the Canadian culture, there were no negatives associated with it, but they only said stuff like, it's very inclusive, it's accepting of others, it's open to differences, it gives me equal opportunities, and it kind of allows me to be who I want to be without putting restrictions on me. So then I asked them, how do you identify yourself? Are you Canadian? Are you Punjabi Canadian? Are you just Punjabi, just Indian, South Asian? Or if they had any other personal words they wanted to use. So 4 out of the 10 participants said they were just Canadian, and 3 of them said they were Punjabi Canadian, 1 said Punjabi, 1 said Indian, and 1 was in between Indo-Canadian and South Asian. She just wasn't sure which one she wanted to use. And then I asked them to explain their answers. So those who identified as Canadian felt that they were Canadian simply because they were born and brought up in Canada. And they'd rather be associated with being Canadian instead of Punjabi or Indian because that part was considered backwards and uncultured. The ones who said they were Punjabi Canadian said that they really appreciated living in a diasporic space where they were allowed to be I guess, allowed to practice being Punjabi and having their heritage while also engaging in Canadian activities without having, I guess, barriers. And then for those who identified as South Asian, Indian, or Punjabi, said that they never felt that they had to explain to anyone they were Canadian simply because they were living in Canada. However, they said if they ever left for a vacation or went somewhere else, they for sure always said they were Canadian. And then if somebody said, no, who are you really? Then they would say, well, my family is from India, or we're from Punjab. So that was really interesting. And then I guess the concept of identity conflict came up. So even though they gave me all these elaborate answers for why they were Punjabi or why they were Canadian, 8 of the 10 participants expressed experiencing identity conflict at various times in their lives. Most of them at this point were either in high school and university. And you have to remember that in the high schools that they went to were predominantly South Asian populations. But while they were in those high schools, they had a really strong desire to be Canadian. And by Canadian, all that means is that they want to take part in Canadian mainstream activities. Those are dating, going out, dressing a certain way, just being the average, Canadian or the American girl. However, pressures from their parents, as I'm sure a lot of the girls in this room can relate to, kind of pressured them to maintain a connection to their Punjabi heritage or their Punjabi culture. So they always found it a little difficult to remain active simultaneously in two very contradicting and opposing cultures. And as a result, not all of them were sure about who they wanted to be, if they wanted to be one or the other, or if they wanted to be either. So then, despite the fact that majority of the participants had favored Canadian values and identified as Canadians, when I asked them if they wanted to be connected to their Punjabi roots while living in Canada, 9 out of 10 of them said, yes, we want to be connected. And I've got some quotes that kind of highlight the roots, the importance of roots for the participants. These are made up names, I didn't use real names. So one of the participants, age 23, said, it's important to know where I come from, where my family's roots are. However, the same participant said she is only Canadian and she doesn't identify with being Punjabi or Indian. And then Amin, age 21, said, it makes me who I am. And Rani, age 19, said, I really appreciate where my parents come from. I feel like it's important to have that identity of self. So the most important or the most interesting part of these quotes is that despite the critiquing of how backwards Punjabi culture was, and especially for the sake of being women, almost all of them said that they want some sort of a connection with that culture. And this kind of ties into the role of them being cultural transmitters. So I guess as cultural transmitters, these women are responsible for passing the culture down to the next generation, so their children. Despite their critiques of the cultures, they had this inherent desire to stay connected with the culture, and that was up to them how they wanted to do it. Everyone had, they felt they could pick and choose whatever they wanted from the culture and whatever they wanted to pass down. And I guess the most crucial of them was all their desire to make sure that their children in the future knew Punjabi and they knew the culture of Punjab, and they knew, a lot of them wanted the kids to be familiar with the religion, and there was this constant intersectionality between Punjabi culture and the Sikh religion, and I can tell you a lot of girls don't know the difference. And maybe that's how the parents have kind of manipulated the culture to maybe police their daughters into behaving a certain way, which I will talk about later. But they assume that they're the same thing. So 9 out of 10 of them associated a familiarity with the language as something that they would want their children to know. And the most interesting part was most of these participants themselves were not fluent in Punjabi, but they wanted their children to be fluent in Punjabi. Some of them even wanted their children to know how to read and write in Punjabi. And only one participant knew how to read and write in Punjabi. So that's really interesting. One of the participants was very, I guess, adamant about the fact that she feels she's not able to connect with her Punjabi heritage because she can't speak the language, and she'd like to know more, but she can't go to an elderly person in our community and ask them more. She wasn't sure if they would misinterpret what she was saying, and so there was that lack of, I guess, she had to bridge that gap somehow, but she felt it was too late to now go back and learn and just kind of try making things easier. So I guess at this point, what I was thinking was, does this mean that the parents have been successful in passing down the culture to their daughters, because now those daughters all of a sudden want to pass this down to their kids? So are they really Punjabi? Are they really Canadian? What are they? And then came this notion of the wild Western woman versus the good Punjabi woman, and the actions of the latter do not always align with the image of the good Punjabi. The actions. My word's missing. Okay, so the Punjabi daughter is expected to be the opposite of the hypersexual white woman. It's really important to remember, and for the purpose of this study, that in this case, being Canadian is equated with being white. So being Canadian does not have a certain set of values that, I'm Canadian, but for these girls and for their parents, being Canadian meant being white. So for this research, I found 4 major critiques or impacts the participants explained as a result of having their bicultural identities. So the top 4 are, there's a lot of gender inequality in this culture. There's a lot of clothing restrictions. There's limited socializing with the opposite sex, and there's no going out or staying out. That doesn't mean none of it happens. It still happens, as you guys are going to see. So the number 1 issue discussed by the women, which created difficulties for them, were because they were Punjabi women who were living in Canada. There were certain gender roles they were expected to follow, but didn't like the fact, and were very, very critical of the heavy patriarchy in the Punjabi culture. As Punjabi women, they were expected to follow traditional gender roles, such as cooking, cleaning, and other domestic chores. However, the same was never expected of their male counterparts, which in most cases with their brothers or their cousins. And the most interesting part was that, and I'm sure many of the girls can relate, even though they didn't accept or didn't like the kind of traditional gender roles that were enforced upon them, they still took part in them. They still got up and cleaned. They still washed the dishes, simply because they knew if they refused or if they didn't complete them, there would be stricter rules in the house and there would be harsher punishments. And then the second issue, which all the participants discussed, was the restrictions placed on what they could and couldn't wear. So all the 10 participants stated that at some point in their lives they had been restricted from wearing sleeveless tops, dresses, shorts, skirts, bathing suits, and simply because they went against Punjabi cultural norms. And modern dress was deemed as a sexual threat, and it's equated with the wild Western woman, as I was discussing earlier. And the showing of the skin indicates that being sexual, which correlates with being modern and Western, all of which is forbidden, according to the Punjabi parents of these participants. And majority of the participants expressed that they still break these restrictions and they still wear whatever they want to wear, simply because they don't find showing skin a big deal. Again, the whole concept of showing skin has been sexualized, as research shows. And the most interesting part was that this came out in two participants, and they said that due to the constant policing of what they could and couldn't wear, and due to the forever nagging of their moms, that they couldn't wear this or they couldn't buy this, they actually altered their wardrobes to fit their mother's wishes. And now as a result, they do not feel comfortable showing their legs, wearing bathing suits, wearing anything that reveals a little too extra. So they have become uncomfortable in their own skin because of that. And then the third issue, which came up again and again and again and again, was the whole restriction placed on them in terms of engaging with the opposite sex. So that meant having male friends, dating or being in intimate relationships with boys. And then this resulted in, of course, them still taking part in all of this just behind their parents' backs. So it didn't really stop them, but I'll get into that later. One of the participants, who is currently 24 years old, has not told her parents about her boyfriend of 3 years, simply because she doesn't know how they would react if they find out that she's been in a relationship all these years without their knowledge, and that too with a Polish man. So she's thinking of marrying him, she just doesn't know how she's gonna go about it, because that would obviously involve a lot of other issues. And then all of the women, every single one of them, discussed the restrictions placed on them, that because they were a result of the concept of izzat, which is honor. Punjabi women are always taught to think about their family's izzat before doing anything that could bring shame upon the family name. So the research indicated that the izzat of the family lies in the virginity of their unmarried daughters. Furthermore, sexual behavior is heavily regulated and protected through boundaries through which the women carry the family honor literally on their bodies. Restricting girls from talking to boys in the participants, according to the participants, was simply a way of protecting their marriageability and in case their virginity is lost. However, as I said earlier, these factors didn't stop the women from engaging with men. Again, because simply they felt that talking to a boy, dating, or being in a relationship was just a part of mainstream Canadian culture, and everybody else was doing it. And there was also this constant, they kept reminding me that if they didn't wear certain clothing or if they didn't go out, do all the normal things, their friends would think they're very backwards and uncultured. However, the restrictions also created some social barriers for some of the participants. So some women said that while they kept boys a secret, others reported limitations placed by their parents created such a barrier that now they had trouble speaking to boys or guys. So two of the participants, I really liked the quotes that they gave me. One of them had said, like, I can't talk to boys freely. Like, even at uni, I know my parents aren't going to be there, but I still can't have that. I still have that feeling of I can't. This is a 21-year-old female. And then Simi, age 24, said, there are certain times when I feel uncomfortable talking to men, not guys my age, but older men, whether they're Punjabi or not. Even if I'm walking down the street and a guy looks at me, my eyes will drop because it's not something you're supposed to do. So sorry, these codes, they're a great example of the result of conditioning which takes place through the moral codes of izzat, something which Punjabi girls are again made familiar with from a very young age. And the good Punjabi girl trope is created to encourage women to self-regulate around particular boundaries and gender roles. And then the last issue that was again discussed again and again was that good girls don't stay out late. This complicated the bicultural identity of the participants quite a lot because a lot of them just wanted to go out again and again be normal Canadian girls. Curfews, however, were put in effect as a policing method by their parents, and in some cases even grandparents. All 10 of the participants discussed the fact that they're not allowed to go out when they want, and they're not allowed to go out with whoever they want. There's a constant, I guess, their moms always want to know who they're with. They want phone numbers, they want names, and they want to know if their family's Punjabi and where they live, and there has to be some sort of a connection for that to happen. And I know there's some moms in the room right now, so. And then, so I asked them, why is that? Why do they want to know? And again, the girls said it's because they want to protect their honor in case something happens when we're out. So historically, Punjabi women have been monitored and chaperoned out of fear of any incident occurring which may tarnish her or her family's name and create obstacles for her in the marriage market. It's not respectable for women to be seen out late at night, was the answer that I got. And a lot of the women were also critical of a common phrase used by many parents: we trust you, but we don't trust the world. By saying this, parents are hinting at the fact that when a woman steps out at night, her honor may be jeopardized if her virginity is lost. Their parents' fears are related to the dangers associated with tarnishing their izzat. As I discussed earlier, the woman literally carries that izzat on her body, and that's how the community and her family are able to police her. And then I guess closer to the end of the research, I kind of found that there was a lot of backlash that some of the participants felt due to having a stronger desire to be Canadian. So 9 out of the 10 participants said that choosing to be Canadian while belonging to a Punjabi community has resulted in problems for them in their childhood and even adulthood. So choosing to identify or partake in Canadian culture while rejecting Punjabi culture has resulted in backlash from family and friends because they're reminded that this is not who they actually are. So a lot of the times they're told, it's important to remember that yes, you live in Canada, but you're not actually Canadian. And that whole idea of being Canadian, again, is equated with being white. So there was this really good quote from one of the participants. She said, yeah, like guys, they'll say, oh, you can't make roti? How much do you even know about your own culture? So for these women, knowing how to cook wasn't Punjabi culture. Knowing how to make a round roti wasn't Punjabi culture. It was rather their connection to the language or the heritage, or in some cases the religion as well, rather than the traditional gender roles, which they were really, really critical about. And then this was my favorite part in my whole research. The participants were asked whether being somebody who belongs to two different cultures results in them lying or rebelling against their parents. A majority of the participants agreed that they have lied or rebelled against their parents. And the primary reason for that was because of where they were going and whom they were going with. And I found that the participants felt that they preferred to lie more simply because it was easier than rebelling. If they rebelled, they would have to, there would be a bigger, fight, and then there would be bigger consequences. They could easily lie and leave and come back and nobody would find out, then and there at least. However, 8 of the 8 participants who expressed that they lie, 5 of them stated that they feel guilty when they do it. And they're not able to enjoy themselves when they do leave after they have lied because they have this constant fear of they're going to get caught or someone's going to see them and it's going to go back to their parents. Only 2 of the participants said they have never lied nor rebelled. And their reasoning was because they knew if they did that, it might not be pretty, the results might not be pretty, and it might result in stricter rules from their families. And I have this really interesting quote from one of the participants, Kushi. She said, "My parents care so much about what others think in the community, and they stress that so much that if I do something wrong, it not only tarnishes my name, but also tarnishes their name as well. So they make it seem like I owe it to them not to rebel. I wouldn't say I've rebelled. I think I play it safe, but I've rebelled in the sense that I have fought back verbally because I think it's important for them to know how I feel. But if my parents say no to something, I probably won't do it. I'll fight back as much as I can, but if the final answer is no, I just don't. I think it goes back to the fact that I was socialized to believe everything I do impacts them." So to conclude, my research indicates that it's quite difficult being Punjabi and Canadian in the same place at the same time, since both of those cultures are very contradicting. The result of this is often associated with identity conflict, as you saw, and a distorted sense of belonging and self. Participants are very critical of the patriarchy in Punjabi culture and the role it plays in disrupting their identity as Punjabi women living in Canada and the restrictions it places on them particularly. And participants suggested that it's important to consider these differences between Punjabi heritage and traditional cultural values, which demean women or place them secondary to men. So for many of them, knowing the language and the history of Punjab is much more important than getting up and making a round roti. Other than that, I guess this was kind of like a self-reflection for me, being a Canadian Punjabi woman and living in Canada. My parents are not strict, they're very liberal, but still there have been incidents where you want to do something, and being the elder daughter in the family, I have a younger sister who's here with me today, and we're 2 different people, and there are reasons for that. It was just kind of my own personal, I guess, a route to finding out who I was as a Canadian Punjabi woman, and I would not say I know the answer. I do not know the answer yet. It's a process, and again, I think I want to take the research further and maybe conduct some more interviews and learn more, but those were my findings. And that's it.